Welcome to this talk on the varieties of capitalism framework within institutionalist economics. Throughout much of the 20th century, the study of comparative economic systems focused on the differences between capitalism and communism. That changed starting in the 1990s. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the primary difference between the world's economies was no longer a matter of comparing capitalism with other sorts of economic arrangements. Capitalism became the undeniably dominant mode of economic organization throughout the world, and the task of classifying economic systems became one of distinguishing different types of capitalism from each other. It is within this context that Hall and Soskice's Varieties of Capitalism framework emerged in 2001. You'll often hear me refer to it throughout this talk as the VOC framework. The starting point of VOC theory is to point out that economies must solve coordination problems. Citing Ostrom's 1990 paper, Hall and Soskice point to, quote, the exchange of information among actors, the monitoring of behavior, and the sanctioning of defection from cooperative behavior as examples of coordination problems which economists will find familiar. These sorts of dilemmas are unavoidable. All firms must have ways of resolving coordination problems like these if they are to be functional. Because its capabilities are ultimately relational, a firm encounters many coordination problems. Its success depends substantially on its ability to coordinate effectively with a wide range of actors. Without a set of established rules by which the cooperation of economic actors is facilitated, inefficiencies will abound. So how, according to VOC theory, are these coordination problems solved? In a word, institutions. Institutions, as defined by the famous economist North in 1991, are, quote, the humanly devised constraints that structure political, economic, and social interaction. They include both cultural norms and explicit government legislation. They can be created suddenly by actions, statutory or otherwise, that establish formal institutions and their operating procedures. But they can also form gradually when repeated historical experience builds up a set of common expectations that allow the actors to coordinate effectively with each other. Whether formed by political mandate or unspoken consensus, institutions serve the same purpose. They are necessary to establish those rules and avoid inefficiencies. In VOC theory, it is precisely the arrangement of those institutions, the economic institutions that solve coordination problems, by which different kinds of capitalism are classified. It sorts economies by the different institutions they utilize to solve coordination problems. To create its economic taxonomy, VOC theory hones in on 5 areas of economic life in which coordination problems must be solved. Hall and Soskice call them the 5 spheres. They focus on these areas in particular because they are, quote, the 5 spheres in which firms must develop relationships to solve coordination problems central to their core competencies. These domains are the ones where the formation of high-quality coordinating institutions are the most beneficial, and where the absence of them is most catastrophic. The 5 spheres are as follows. 1. Industrial relations, where employers and employees negotiate the level of wages and quality of working conditions. 2. Vocational training and education, where employers seek workers with appropriate skills and workers decide the nature and extent of their skilling. 3. Corporate governance, where businesses seek financing and investors seek returns on their investments. 4. Interfirm relations, where businesses determine the extent and nature of their cooperation and conflict with each other. Finally, the 5th sphere, number 5, employee relations, where employers seek to ensure that employees cooperate with each other and aim to further the goals of the business. The institutions which solve coordination problems in each sphere lie on a spectrum from liberal to coordinated. Liberal institutions tend to be characterized by competitive market arrangements. Coordinated institutions, on the other hand, tend to solve coordination problems using collaborative, non-market mechanisms. For example, take the industrial relations sphere. A liberal institution that solves the wage-setting coordination problem in this sphere is individual wage bargaining, where individuals compete amongst each other in the labor market to secure pay and working conditions. A coordinated institution to solve the same problem is collective bargaining. With collective bargaining, workers do not compete as much with each other, but instead cooperate amongst themselves to form trades unions and secure a collective wage agreement. Now consider another example, this time with regard to the education and vocational training sphere. One of the coordination problems of this sphere is the matter of how specialized skills should be. A liberal institution which solves that problem is generalized skilling via formal educational institutions. Workforces with generalized skills are interchangeable and tend to compete with each other on the market for the same jobs. A coordinated institution to solve that same problem would be specialized skilling via apprenticeships. Workers whose skills are less interchangeable compete with each other to a lesser extent. Every sphere's coordination problems have institutions like this to solve them, and those institutions range from liberal to coordinated. Institutions in different spheres do not operate independently of one another. Those which lie on one side of the liberal coordinated spectrum in one sphere tend to reinforce institutions on the same side of that spectrum in other spheres. This is the notion of institutional complementarity in VOC theory. Institutional complementarity is, to quote a researcher named Amable, it's the idea that certain institutional forms, when jointly present, reinforce each other and contribute to improving the functioning, coherence, or stability of specific institutional configurations, varieties, or models of capitalism. To illustrate, take the examples provided above. The liberal wage-setting institution of individual bargaining in the industrial relations sphere, and the liberal institution of generalized skilling in the vocational training sphere reinforce each other. Generalized skilling encourages individual competition over the same jobs. And individual bargaining incentivizes workers to acquire skills that make them adaptable across different sectors. Likewise, the coordinated wage-setting institution of collective bargaining and the coordinated institution of specialized skilling reinforce each other. Specialized skilling gives workers the bargaining power to form trades unions, and collective bargaining facilitates the improved wages and working conditions that make specialized skilling attractive. Liberal institutions complement other liberal institutions. Coordinated institutions complement other coordinated institutions. However, liberal and coordinated institutions do not complement each other. The liberal wage-setting institution of individual bargaining and the coordinated institution of specialized skilling undermine each other. Specialized skilling undermines the competition between workers that facilitates individual bargaining. And individual bargaining will fail to facilitate a wage bargain that makes specialized skilling attractive. The coordinated wage-setting institution of collective bargaining and the liberal institution of generalized skilling undermine each other as well. Generalized skilling will foster too much competition between workers for them to form collective bargaining units, and workers will be forced to develop specialized skills if they are to gain enough leverage to maintain their collective bargaining agreements. Liberal institutions undermine coordinated institutions. Coordinated institutions undermine liberal ones. For this reason, countries whose institutions are liberal in one sphere tend to be liberal in the other spheres, and those whose institutions are coordinated in one sphere tend to be coordinated in the others as well. Because of institutional complementarity, countries tend not to solve their coordination problems with a random assortment of liberal and coordinated institutions. Instead, they tend to have institutions that are mostly all liberal or mostly all coordinated. The tendency of a country's institutions to fall to one or the other side of the liberal coordinated spectrum allows VOC theory to distinguish between two types of political economies, what Hall and Soskice call liberal market economies and coordinated market economies. These constitute the ideal types at the poles of a spectrum along which many nations can be arrayed. Liberal market economies, or LMEs, are those whose five spheres are populated with liberal institutions. Coordinated market economies, or CMEs, have spheres populated with coordinated institutions. To quote Hall and Soskice, in liberal market economies, firms coordinate their activities primarily via hierarchies and competitive market arrangements, while in coordinated market economies, firms depend more heavily on non-market relationships to coordinate their endeavors with other actors and to construct their core competencies. Hall and Soskice categorize America and Germany, respectively, as the canonical liberal and cooperative economies. Key LMEs include Australia, Canada, Ireland, New Zealand, the UK, and the US. Key CMEs include Austria, Belgium, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, Germany, Japan, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Switzerland. In their view, France, Italy, Spain, Portugal, Greece, and Turkey are left ambiguous. Some economies, like the ones I just mentioned a moment ago, the ambiguous ones, they cannot be neatly classified as either an LME or a CME. One researcher named Hank calls these sorts of economies mixed market economies, or MMEs. He says that they, quote, sustain subsystems that are far from correctly calibrated over time. So why does he say this? Hank refers to MMEs as not being correctly calibrated because, as VOC theory suggests, uncomplementary institutions are expected to be inefficient. In this vein, Amable has argued that intermediary economies, MMEs, if you want to call them that, they have poor capacity for developing technological intensity, the consequence precisely of institutional a-complementaries. Researchers Hall and Gingerich showed empirically in 2009 that MMEs, hybrid systems, whatever you want to call them, function less optimally than those which are distinctly liberal or coordinated. A basic understanding of institutional complementarity may give the impression that VOC theory cannot account for institutional change. A sophisticated VOC theory must account for the fact that institutions do indeed change. Take the case of Germany. The founding authors of VOC theory consider it to be the canonical CME. However, even the institutions of this most archetypal coordinated economy are subject to alteration. As Amable writes, the key institutions of the German model have experienced change in a decidedly non-coordinating direction for the past 2 or 3 decades. If the LME-CME bifurcation is to be comprehensive enough, using those ideal types in order to analyze the diversity of capitalism should not always lead to the conclusion that actual economies never change, or that the existing types always have been there as they are now. The way that VOC theory accounts for change is through the notion of institutional stability. Institutions which need fewer external influences in order to change are said to be more stable. The amount of external influences necessary to change an institution is itself dependent on the presence of institutional interaction, where the benefits of changing one institution are likely to be realized only when a substantial number of other institutions are also transformed. That institution should be more stable. Conversely, when there are alternative institutional means available for accomplishing a task, a firm's interests may bind it less tightly to one institution. This means that institutions are more stable to the degree that they are more interactive. Economies with lower degrees of institutional interaction are highly liable to change. In economies like this, coordination is not easily secured and rarely follows automatically from the presence of certain institutions. Instead, active support for a specific mode of coordination must be mobilized on a relatively continuous basis from actors who are conscious of the limitations as well as the advantages of any particular course of action. Achieving and maintaining coordination also usually involves the exercise of power. The integration of institutional change into the VOC framework helps to renege accusations that it is too functionalist. The existence of complementarity does not always mean that institutional arrangements are eternally set in stone. The presence of institutional instability means that VOC theory can account for ways that economies break from efficient and self-reinforcing structures to inefficient and self-contradictory ones. Depending on the arrangement of institutional interactions, complementarity can go both ways, reinforcing or weakening an existing institutional configuration. Beyond a certain degree of change, previously stabilizing complementarities will become destabilizing according to the same mechanisms that previously ensured the stability of that institutional structure. The varieties of capitalism approach is not functionalist in other ways as well, as Hall and Phelan write, although it shares the functionalist premise that the support that groups provide for an institution is motivated to some extent by the benefits the institution provides flowing from the functions it performs. It is different in two ways. First, varieties of capitalism theory does not assume that support for an institution derives primarily from the contribution it makes to aggregate economic welfare. And second, in contrast to some functionalist theories, it's not necessarily true that the institutions specified in varieties of capitalism were originally created to serve the interests that they advance at a much later period in time. The exogenous shocks which can trigger change in the presence of low institutional stability can be more or less visible. Drawing on game theoretic sensibilities, Hall and Phelan describe defection as one of the less visible types. Defection is, quote, when actors who have been following the practices prescribed by an institution stop doing so. Chief among the visible types is what they call reform. They define it as, quote, institutional change explicitly mandated or endorsed by governments. The former generally takes place more implicitly and over longer time span, while the latter tends to happen explicitly and all at once. That concludes this overview of the varieties of capitalism framework in institutionalist economics. Thank you to Professor David Howell for introducing this to me. If you'd like to reach out to me, either for tutoring in economics or just to discuss topics in economics, you can do so via the link in the description. See you in the next one.